All right, for this exercise, we're going to be looking at 1-point and 2-point interior perspectives and exterior perspectives and what they give us, why we might select them. So first thing I'm going to do is let's find kind of a midpoint. So I'm splitting up where I've got two sets here. I'm now going to draw my horizon line for these top drawings. I'm just going to draw a line across like this. And I'm going to look at we're going to draw multiple drawings in this one drawing. I'm going to draw 1-point interior perspective here. I'm starting off with a point and I'm saying I'm going to draw a line right here. And remember when I said we have the horizon line? We're understanding, as soon as we draw the vertical, we're understanding the scale of the drawing. I know this eye height is at 5 feet is a given one. So it means as soon as I draw this line, I have a measurement of 5 feet there, because that's where I finish the line. That's 5 feet. I can average, that's 10, that's 15 feet tall. I've got a 15-foot line there because that's the horizon line and that's the height. Now let's say, this 1-point perspective, I want it to be 10 feet wide but 15 feet tall. Well, in this plane, they call it the picture plane, in the plane that I'm drawing, I know that, well, I can go equally measure in that plane, staying square to everything. So I went 5 up, there's 5 over, another 5 over. Now I've measured that is a 15 by 10 foot wide space. 1 point, meaning all of that square, we're looking at one surface directly. Here's my vanishing point. I can now do that trick that we just walked through, which actually I'm going to rotate this and go from here. I want to go, remember this is what we were just working on in the first exercise. I'm moving it around because I want it to be right. I drag out and then I make sound effects. Sorry, it's just what I do. And the last one, I really do it best when I do it. Okay, now for a little fun, I'm going to say floor, wall, ceiling, and let's say this wall is at half the height there is. Now watch this. I want to say this wall has a thickness, and I'm looking underneath it, meaning I can walk out underneath here, and this is a wall that's coming over the top of me. So I want to see the bottom of the thickness of this wall. So because it's a 1 point, horizontally, same as anything in this plane, horizontal, 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 and then that's the thickness of the wall I'm putting, and then I draw, now I'm seeing the bottom of that thickness. Now watch this, I can go heavy edge, heavy edge, heavy edge, and now I've got what would be, I'm standing in a room but it's open out here. I might go through really quickly and I can say we can take that idea of doing some tone like we had before, again adding a few more at the beginning. Start to see that go off. I might even do it over here just to let that read. Okay, we're going to go a little more over tone and rendering materials in the next one. But now, so 1 point interior, okay? I'm going to do another vignette over here doing the same thing, and I'm going to try to stay to the same idea. Watch this. I'm going to take a point here, same way as that vanishing point. I'm even going to start with the same line, the same distance over, meaning that I always say in that other tutorial, the strong vertical, like an identifiable vertical that you know you can measure. And so the same way, I'm actually going to take the same size, meaning here, meaning 5 feet below, 15 feet tall. I'm going to draw the same thing, but as if we had turned and looked to the right, meaning this one we're facing dead out the end. But what if we were in this room and we looked to the right a little more? It would then become a 2-point perspective. But this line is exactly the same. I'm going to use that as the same measuring tool. okay? So from there, I can take, and I could actually even just start and say, look, there's my perspective out. There's my perspective out. But now what we're going to do is going to say, I'm looking out to the right, and let's say that there would be a vanishing point, and I'm going to say it's way over here, almost off my paper. I'm going to put one way over there, okay? And I'm going to say, look, now this wall, I'm turning way to the right, is vanishing way over this way. And this is way vanishing. So now that end wall is not square to us anymore. That line and that line are not square because it's a 2 point, so it's going to another perspective, right? So now those are going off to a distant perspective. Now what's kind of tough, but what's interesting is that we can actually find here, we could just measure the 10 feet in the exact way we measured the 10 feet in that, because the picture plane was square. What's interesting is we can still measure, we just have to say directly in this perspective. So the same way I could measure the 10 over again, just like I did here, but that's coming out straight, not in the perspective of this. What's interesting is, so now I measured 5 out, another 5 is 10, but that's level and perspective. Now, if I converge this back, that point, where that dimension that I measured perspects back to there, gives me the actual distance of this one in this perspective. Okay, so this is kind of interesting, little way of looking at it. We were able to measure in the picture plane of the object that we were scaling. So this is the device that we were scaling with, this wall, this corner. I could measure out straight and then perspect back and find where that intersection was, okay? So that was in essence that corner in that perspective. Now I can find midway. What's interesting is midpoint is always midpoint. So midpoint here, which we could measure, I could find it differently. I could also just say, hey, what is the midpoint of this? Because the midpoint of one is going to be the midpoint of the other. Or I can take a point here, go in that perspective, and where it hits this wall would be that midpoint. They'll be at the same spot. Okay. Now the same way I constructed this, I'm going to take that line out. I can take that. You see how that, should have rotated it. There we go. I'll do this bottom line again. Okay, so now we're getting that line, and that line the same way. Now I got the thickness of here. Here I went straight horizontal because it was 1 point. Here I have to converge back in that line. There's the bottom line here. Here it's angling, here it's level. And now with that distance, there. So now in this one, heavy, 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 heavy. Okay, if I want to come back in, I could still do the same. Just a tone, a couple walls to get something to punch. Okay. If you want to get really fancy, the horizon line again is also a great way to let stuff read. Now we're feeling that outside, how open that is, right? That's helping us read that we're looking off in the distance there, helping us read. Now, what is the difference between these two? Why would we choose to do one over the other? The 2 point is inherently more dynamic, meaning we feel like we're moving. We typically feel like the space is moving. If we're talking about circulation, if we're talking about views or changing things beyond, or the architecture itself feeling like it's moving or floating or not static. You know, this 1 point is very fixed, concrete. This is a technique used to talk about permanence. Like there's kind of a psychological permanence to a 1 point perspective. Everything is about this, and it's very controlling. So understand that those are all attributes that somebody inherently feels when they look at that drawing versus this drawing. So depending on what you want to communicate about your design, we would choose to do a 1 point or a 2 point because of how it makes people feel, okay, what they inherently get from the drawing. Let's look at a 2 point. Let's look at the exterior instead of the interior. So again, horizon line. And we're going to do 2 drawings again. I'm sorry if that's confusing. I like the idea of being put the hands over it. Those, but so now I'm going to take for an exterior. I'm going to put a point again. I'm going to take and I'm going to do that same like line here. Measure. Say okay, if that's 5 feet right there. Again, another 5. Again, another 5. Now we're that hand. Go again. That equal over. Equal over. Now we have what would be this 10 feet by 15 feet. Okay, now exterior perspective, if that is the surface and the buildings behind it, if this is an object, if this is a 10 by 15 foot tall block out there, and we're looking at it, we don't see anything in perspective unless something's coming out towards us, right? So let's say there's a walkway, kind of maybe a sidewalk or a little. On that surface, I'm going to say, hey, look, maybe there's a ramp or like a boardwalk that's coming out towards us. So now I can take that and say, okay, now all of a sudden, we've got a walkway going into this, right? Feel like we're on a boardwalk. Maybe there's a large roof overhang. So maybe so notice that maybe there's a 5 foot overhang and a 5 foot overhang and a big roof that comes all the way out towards us. So in this thing, I can still measure. What was that? 5 feet? Let's say 2.5 feet. Let's say if that was 5 feet, that's 2.5 feet. That was 5 feet. That's 2.5 because that's in that picture plane. That's square to where that measuring line was, right? So this is the difference. We can measure only in that one plane where that measuring stick is. Everything else is in perspective. So there's that on that point and that point. We know the roof eave, if it's 2.5 feet, is going to be there. So now I can go okay, and now we have all right, so now we have a plane coming at us. Now, what I would say is that, well, let's draw the other one and then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to do almost the same thing. I'm going to reverse a little bit. I'm going to put a point over here. Actually, we're going to go a little farther. I'm going to put a VP right there. I'm going to reverse this. I'm going to put the line to the outside a little farther away. Okay, and again, I'm going to take about those same dimensions. Let's say if that's going to be my 5 feet. Remember, I'm determining that. I'm determining the scale. If I say that's 5 feet, well then now that's the scale I'm working with, right? So there's my lines there and there. Now, again, I'm going to project a second point way over here. Okay? Now I can look right this and say, look, I know my perspective lines are doing something like this. There's my line over here. Okay, I know my volume, that corner right there is this corner right here, right? I can it's the same measurement, same thing. I'm just now seeing the outside of this wall and then this face right here, right? So now all of a sudden, how do we get those other dimensions? Well, remember, we can measure exactly in this plane that's not the perspectives. So this is what's weird is I can go, okay, remember when we did it up here, I moved in this plane 5 over level, another 5 over. So there's 10 feet right there, right? So that's 10, but I'm not in perspective. Now, if I come back and perspect back, see how if I perspect back, that's where that perspective crosses the line. There is that 10-foot width. So I had to find it in that plane and then project back to that line. Okay. The same way I could do. Let's say it's 15 feet deep. We don't know the depth of this. Let's say it's 15 foot deep. So if I go back, I can say, okay, in this line, I just measured 10 to the right. I'm going to measure 5, 10, 15 feet to this side. Okay, because remember, I'm staying level, I'm staying in this picture plane right at that point, not in the perspective, but in actually the plane that we're drawing in. Now from that point, if I perspect back to here, that, where it crosses, is 15 feet back in that. Okay, so now there is our object. Okay. Now with that said, we could kind of do these same things. I could find the midpoint, or I could find the midpoint of this. I could find the midpoint, but I could project this 5 back and find the midpoint, or I could draw the X, and that would also find the midpoint, right? Both of those should find the same point. And I'm going to say, hey, look, I'm just going to estimate really quickly that same idea, the boardwalk shooting out, and now all of a sudden I can take and draw that. Now remember, we had the distance 2.5 feet up, so that's where that 2.5 is. I could go 2.5 over, meaning half of this distance back, and now up. See how I'm finding that point, I'm finding those dimensions, and now I know where those overhangs, I just found those 2 points that were here, I found them in perspective on that perspective line. Now all of a sudden, okay. Let's say the roof ends right at the end. Now, I would typically run, if I'm going to run the texture on this, I'm running, see how here it was easy because I'm just doing horizontal and horizontal. I've been playing in the planes. But if this is surface, notice I'm running those lines in perspective. I'm following that gradient. What I'm doing is I'm helping the person's eye understand the perspective by letting these lines converge to the vanishing point. I would still probably add more back there, add more back there. All right, now why would we choose to do this one or this one? I'll be honest, almost never, almost no reason to do this one. We can always make a 2-point that will tell us a little more information. I'll just be honest, like, there's just try to get away from doing this because it's just a missed opportunity. There's just so much more that can be talked about. The whole point of doing a perspective is that we're understanding it 3-dimensionally, and no matter what the object, we might be reading some depth to it, but the only way that I made it to read depth was pretending that it was almost an interior space by putting a floor and a ceiling. I mean a bridge and a walkway, right? But really, it's just an object in the background where this lets us understand that to such a greater ability. Okay? So, no. 1-point interior, okay, but controlling. 2-point interior, great, dynamic, we're kind of feel like we're moving around. 1-point exterior, terrible. 2-point exterior, definitely how we kind of understand object, space, and everything around it.